Hello, welcome back to the Giant Papist, where we judge not by appearances, but by the sanity of one's doctrine. This video will be doing the Gospel reading and reflection for the Tuesday of the second week of Lent. The reading is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. This is the first third, if you will, of Matthew's recording of Jesus's denouncing of the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. So, without further ado, let us get to the lesson for today's video. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do, for they preach, but do not practice. They bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by men, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, and salutations in the marketplaces, and being called Rabbi by men. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brethren. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called masters, for you have one Master, the Christ. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Thus endeth the lesson. All right, so first set of notes. Phylacteries. We shouldn't necessarily be thinking Dungeons and Dragons. In this case, phylacteries were little letter boxes containing on a very small scroll the principal words of the law of Moses. Taking the command literally, they fastened these to their arms and their foreheads. And then on the note on call no man father that Christians within axe to grind against the church constantly use against the church. Note that what Jesus is actually saying is do not use the title Father without reference to God's universal fatherhood. Jesus cannot mean that the title is never to be used by a son to his father. So when he says, call no man father, he's essentially stating that we shouldn't let any man usurp the authority that belongs to God the Father alone. We're allowed to call people fathers. We just have to be careful we're not doing it in that sense. Right. Right. So the main sin that these 12 verses opened up before Jesus lays it into them in later verses is the hypocrisy of the scribes, the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. Their hypocrisy is that their piety is false, not genuine. Hence, Jesus acknowledging that they sit on the seat of Moses, so they have legitimate teaching authority. So, practice and observe whatever they tell you, but don't imitate what they themselves do, or they preach, but do not practice. This reveals that the Pharisees and the scribes that Jesus is criticizing, the particular ones that he's criticizing, were giving teachings to their fellow men that they themselves were not willing to follow. Hence, the phrase today that's often used in everyday conversation, practice what you preach. The sign of a good teacher is that the teacher should not tell his or her students to do something that they themselves are not willing to do them as well. And this is what the Pharisees and the scribes, the particular ones that Jesus is criticizing, were guilty of. And they also, the binding of heavy burdens, they're adding to what is required from the law of Moses. You know, they are making things just a bit too difficult and unnecessary and demand that people accept these additional burdens as if God himself had preached it through Moses. But Jesus points out that if you pay attention to what they're doing, they themselves are not practicing these unnecessary extra stuff. But isn't it suspicious, Jesus implicitly asks, that they insist that you do it? And Trent Horn, on one of his videos when he was talking about certain groups of Catholics that go a bit too far, if I can put it charitably, I think he, out of charity, rather than outright calling them Pharisees, he had entitled the video Catholic Fundamentalism. It's an excellent video. Go check it out. Where he notes that today the same behavior that Jesus is criticizing is unfortunately practiced by some of our fellow Christians today, where they'll go past what the actual teaching of the church is and insist that you do all these extra stuff, otherwise you're not, quote unquote, a real Christian. As he and Matt Fradd have eloquently summarized Jesus' teaching here as we should not permit what God has forbidden, and at the same time, we should not permit what God that we should not permit what God has forbidden, and at the same time, we should not forbid what God has permitted. You know, simple rule to follow. It is not an easy rule to follow, but it is one we should keep in mind because that is at the heart of the criticism that Jesus is officially giving them on the week of his crucifixion. Again, note false piety versus genuine piety. The whole idea that they seem to prefer the admiration of men more than the admiration of God. They love being treated with honor. They love being greeted respectfully and all that. But should we, if they're not actually doing what God wants them to do? And then he reminds the people, you ultimately have one master, the Christ, the Messiah, i.e., Jesus. You ultimately have one teacher, that is Jesus. By virtue of being created by God and by our spiritual adoption through the sacrament of baptism, we are also all brothers. We are to love our neighbor as ourselves, including those we don't like. And one final note, again, how Jesus eloquently summarizes all of his teachings in one nice speech before he gets to the denouncing, starting on verse 13, which you can read on your own after this video. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. You know, if you want to be a leader, you must be a servant leader. And he hammers this home. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The key to servant leadership is the virtue of humility. We need to have accurate self-assessment before we venture to pick up the cross of leading those that have been placed in our lives, whether by family, ordination, holy orders, or our work that we ultimately, or sports, that we ultimately end up needing to lead, whether we necessarily want to or not. Humility is the key. And when we read the denunciation of the scribes and the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, those specific scribes and Pharisees that were opponents of Jesus, he will reveal that the virtue of humility is what they are lacking. Let us be humble. And with that, that is the end of today's lesson. As always, judge not by appearances, but by the sanity of one's doctrine. This has been the Giant Papist, and I'll see you till the next video.